When June Holloway's father died and left her 40 acres of Missouri clay and a stack of unpaid loans, the entire county had one opinion: let it go. The soil was spent, the debts were growing, and a woman alone, no husband, no sons, no partner, had no business trying to rescue land that 3 generations of men had already worn down to nothing. But June didn't let it go. Instead, she did something that made every farmer in Holt County stop and stare. She borrowed more money she didn't have, and spent it on 180 chickens nobody wanted. Not seed, not equipment, chickens. And that's when the whole town decided she'd lost her mind. If you've ever bet everything on something nobody else believed in, stay with me. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning June. Holloway buried her father. The sky over Holt County was the color of old dishwater, gray and flat and offering nothing. It was the kind of sky that felt permanent, like it had always been that way and always would be, and it pressed down over the funeral like a hand that didn't mean to be unkind but couldn't quite help itself. There were 11 people at the graveside. June counted them without meaning to. 11 people, including herself, the minister, and Hector Walsh from the bank, who had the decency to remove his hat, but not quite the decency to wait until the prayer was finished before he started talking to her about the loan balance. "June," he said, stepping close as the other mourners drifted toward their trucks. His breath smelled like coffee and something medicinal. "I don't want to do this today. You know I don't." "Then don't," she said. "The bank's been patient. 4 months behind is—" "I know what 4 months behind is, Hector." She didn't look at him. She was looking at the fresh dirt over her father's grave, which was the same pale, exhausted color as the rest of the topsoil on the Holloway property. Clay underneath, hard pan below that. Soil that had been farmed the same way for 60 years and was just about done cooperating. "Give me until spring," Hector Walsh put his hat back on. "I'll give you until January. That's the best I can do." He walked away. June stood there another few minutes, alone now except for the minister packing up his things by the road, and she looked at that 40 acres stretching behind the cemetery fence, her 40 acres now, for whatever that was worth. And she tried to feel something clear and decisive. She didn't. What she felt was tired and slightly nauseated and completely uncertain what she was going to do next. That was September. By October, she'd moved out of the rented room in town where she'd been living since the divorce and back into her father's house, which smelled like old coffee and motor oil and a life that had been lived very hard and not particularly well. The kitchen ceiling had a water stain shaped like the state of Arkansas. 2 of the window latches were broken. There was a list on the refrigerator door in her father's handwriting. Things to fix, someday. That had been there so long the paper had yellowed at the edges and started to curl. June didn't unpack much. She wasn't sure yet if staying was the right decision, but she was 34 years old and she had $2,300 in a checking account and a piece of land that nobody else wanted, and those were the facts she had to work with. She walked the property the first week, methodically, section by section, the way she'd learned to do things, not from farming. She hadn't grown up farming. She'd grown up watching her father fail at it. But from the years she'd spent doing soil assessments for an agricultural consulting firm in Kansas City before the company folded and her marriage fell apart in roughly the same 6-month period. She knew how to read land. She just never had to read land that belonged to her. What she read wasn't encouraging. The east field, which her father had planted in corn for 30 years running without rotation, was so depleted that the stubble left from his last crop looked gray rather than gold. The soil itself, when she knelt and picked up a handful, crumbled into powder with no cohesion, no life in it, none of the dark, wormy richness that healthy ground had. It was basically mineral dust with a memory of having once been something more. The west field was marginally better. He'd left it fallow for 2 years, which had helped some, but marginally better than terrible was still not good. The pH was off. The compaction from decades of machinery was severe. She pushed a metal rod into the ground near the fence line and felt it stop hard at 8 inches. 8 inches of workable soil. In good agricultural land, you wanted 2 feet minimum, ideally more. The garden beds closest to the house were the worst of all. He'd been adding chemical fertilizer every season for years, which had kept yields barely alive but had done nothing for the soil biology. Under the surface, it was essentially sterile, microbially dead. The kind of soil that needed inputs to produce anything, that couldn't sustain itself, that was in a slow and permanent decline. June sat on an overturned bucket in the shed that evening and did the math she'd been avoiding. Total debt to Holt County. Savings? $47,000. Interest accumulating monthly. Current income from the property? Zero. Her own savings? $2,300. Realistic income from a spring crop planted in this soil with her current capital? Maybe $4,000 to $6,000. If everything went right, which it wouldn't because everything going right required good soil and she didn't have good soil. She could sell. The land would go for somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 at current market, which after the loan payoff would leave her maybe $15,000, $18,000, enough to start over somewhere else. Hector Walsh would probably be relieved. Roland Mercer. She'd seen his card tucked in her father's paperwork more than once. The man had apparently been circling this property for years. Would probably show up with an offer before the ink was dry. She could sell. That was the sensible thing. June looked at that yellowed list on the refrigerator door. Things to fix someday. And she thought about her father's hands, which had been rough and cracked from working ground that never quite worked back. And she thought about the fact that he'd spent his whole life on this land and died without fixing a single thing on that list. And she thought, not like that. I'm not doing it like that. She didn't sleep much that night. She made coffee at 2 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down everything she knew about soil restoration. The idea came to her gradually, not as a single revelation, but as a slow accumulation of things she'd read and half remembered and seen and surpassing over the years. Rotational grazing, mob stalking, the way animals, real animals, with weight and manure and scratching behavior, could do things to soil that no amount of chemical amendment could replicate. She'd seen pastures turned around with cattle. She'd read about pigs being used to break up compacted ground. Chickens were different, smaller, cheaper, faster moving. And she'd read one paper, she couldn't remember the source. It had been years ago, some agricultural journal she'd skimmed in a waiting room somewhere, about a farmer in Arkansas who'd used movable chicken pens on his vegetable beds. Not as a permanent setup, as a rotation. Move the birds, they fertilize and scratch and work the organic matter into the surface. Then move them forward and plant behind them. She was not an expert in this. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She had the theoretical framework and a general sense of the biology, and she had absolutely zero practical experience raising chickens. But here was the thing about June Holloway, the thing that her ex-husband had called stubbornness, and her father had called mule-headedness, and that she herself, in more generous moments, thought of as persistence. When she decided a thing was worth trying, she was not easily argued out of it. She spent 3 days at the county library before it occurred to anyone to tell her they had internet access. She read everything she could find, pastured poultry systems, portable pens. They were called chicken tractors, which was a term she found genuinely funny. The ratio of birds to area, how long to leave them on a section before moving them. What to plant behind them, and when. Then she drove to the feed auction in Carterville. The man selling the chicks was named Dale Pruitt, and he had the particular look of someone who'd been up since 4 and was not improving with age. The chicks were in wire crates, 2 weeks old, Rhode Island Reds mostly, and he was asking 8 cents apiece, dirt cheap because they were straight run, meaning unsexed, meaning a good percentage would be roosters, which most people didn't want. How many are you looking at? He said. 180, June said. He looked at her. You got a setup for 180 birds? I'm building one. What kind of operation? Pastured, rotational? He chewed on something invisible for a moment. How much land? 40 acres. He nodded slowly, like he was doing math. That's a lot of birds for 40 acres if you're not careful about it. I know, June said. I've been careful about it. She hadn't been careful about it, exactly. She'd been thorough about it, which was close, but not the same thing. Careful implied certainty. She didn't have certainty. What she had was a plan that she believed in and $2,300 and a loan deadline in January. She wrote the check for $14.40 and loaded the crates into the back of her father's truck. On the drive home, she stopped for gas at the Quick Stop on Route 9, and Harold Dunning from the property east of hers was filling up his pickup at the next pump. Harold was 60-something, had farmed his family land his whole life, and had known June's father since they were boys. He was not a mean man. He was, however, the kind of man who expressed concern in a way that was difficult to distinguish from condescension. "What you got in the back?" he said, squinting at the crates. "Chicks." He walked around and looked, counted silently. "June, I know. That's a lot of chickens." "I know, Harold. You got a coop for all of... I'm building one." She replaced the gas cap and screwed it closed. Or rather, several small ones, movable. Harold Dunning put his hands in his pockets. He had the expression of a man who had many things to say and was weighing which of them would be received worst. "Your daddy tried chickens back in, must have been 98, 99, didn't work out." "Dad kept them in one place," June said. "I'm moving them." Moving them. "Every few days? Rotating across the fields?" Harold was quiet for a moment. Behind him, his engine idled. One of the chicks peeped loudly from the back of her truck. "June," he said finally, with a gentleness that was almost worse than the condescension. "You're what, 4 months behind on the loan?" "About that." "And you spent money on... How many of those is that?" 180. He exhaled through his nose. "You got a plan for paying that loan with chicken manure?" "Essentially, yes," she said. "That's essentially the plan." She got back in the truck before he could say anything else. The first pens took her 2 weeks to build, working evenings and weekends around the days she spent doing contract soil testing for neighboring counties. The part-time work that was keeping her afloat financially, barely. She used scrap lumber from her father's shed and hardware cloth she bought at the farm supply in town, building low rectangular frames 4 feet by 8 with no floor, open to the ground, and a simple wire roof, light enough that she could drag them by herself to the next section when she needed to. She started with the garden beds near the house, the worst soil on the property, put 30 birds on the first section, watched them immediately begin scratching and pecking and doing what chickens do, which is essentially destroying everything in front of them in a methodical and cheerful way. The smell was considerable. Her nearest neighbor to the south, a retired couple named Frank and Donna Keys, drove by slowly one afternoon while she was moving a pen, and Donna rolled down her window. "What are you doing, honey?" Donna asked. Not hostile, just genuinely puzzled. "Soil restoration," June said. Donna looked at the chickens. The chickens looked at Donna. "By letting them walk around on it? And scratch and fertilize and break up the surface crust, yeah." Said Donna. She and Frank exchanged a glance that June couldn't quite read. "You need anything? I made a chicken pot pie." She paused. "Well, maybe not a pot pie." June laughed, which surprised her. It was the first time she'd laughed in about 3 weeks. "I'm okay, but thank you." Frank drove on. June went back to moving the pen. The woman who changed things was Martha Doyle. Martha was 68 years old and had been farming 60 acres of bottomland north of the Holloway property for 43 years, first with her husband Thomas, and then, after Thomas died, by herself. She raised market vegetables and a small herd of Angus cattle and kept what she called a teaching garden, which was a section of experimental beds where she tried things she'd read about or heard about or thought up herself. Martha had white hair she kept in a braid down her back and hands that were perpetually stained with something, soil or beet juice or engine grease depending on the day. She didn't say much. When she did say something, it tended to be worth hearing. She showed up at June's gate on a Thursday morning in mid-October, driving her old Chevy farm truck, and stood at the fence looking at the chicken pens for a long time without saying anything. June walked over. "Can I help you?" "Martha Doyle," the woman said, not turning around. "I farm north of here. You're Jim Holloway's girl." "June, yes." "What are you doing?" Martha asked, still looking at the pens. "Rotational grazing system, using the chickens to restore the soil biology and organic matter before I plant behind them." Martha nodded slowly. "How many days per section?" "I've been doing 4, moving them on the 4th morning." "Too long," Martha said. "You'll compact the surface if you leave them 4 days. 3 days, maximum. Maybe 2 if you're in a wet spell." June looked at her. "You've done this?" "I've done a version of it. With ducks, mostly. Different biology, but similar principle." Martha finally turned around. She had sharp gray eyes that were doing an assessment of June with the same methodical patience June had applied to the soil. "You got a record book?" "I've been keeping notes." "Show me." June showed her. Martha read through the legal pad notes for several minutes, standing in the pale October sunlight, and she made a sound occasionally that was somewhere between approval and skepticism. "Your nitrogen load calculations are off," she said. "I know. I was working from a general formula, and I'm not sure it applies to this soil type." "It doesn't. This is clay-heavy ground. The biology works slower. You'll need to plan for a longer recovery window before you plant on a given section." Martha handed back the legal pad. "Come to my place Saturday morning. I'll show you my records from the duck rotation I did in 2019. Similar soil, similar problem." "I'd appreciate that," June said. Martha nodded once and walked back to her truck. She opened the door, then paused. "You're going to need more pens than that if you want to cover real ground before spring." "I know, I'm building them as fast as I can. I've got lumber you can have, left over from a fence project." Martha got in the truck. 7 in the morning. She drove away without waiting for an answer, which June took as the offer being settled. Welcome. The visits to Martha's farm became a weekly thing, and then something more than weekly, though neither of them named it as such. Martha had the kind of practical knowledge that didn't come from reading. It came from 4 decades of watching a specific piece of ground and paying close attention to what it told her. She knew about soil the way some people knew about music, intuitively, at a level below language, and she transmitted this knowledge in a way that was also below language, through demonstration, through questions, through the occasional sharp correction when June was about to do something wrong. "Don't put the pens on that low section," Martha said one afternoon, standing at the edge of the west field. "Water table's close there. You'll have mud problems, and the nitrogen will leach straight down instead of incorporating." "How do you know the water table's close?" Martha pointed at a patch of rushes along the fence line. "Those don't grow where it's dry." She looked at June. "Walk your land every morning. Look at what's growing where it shouldn't be. That tells you more than any soil test." "I do soil tests for a living," June said. "I know, and they're useful, but they tell you about a moment. The land tells you about a pattern." Martha paused. "Do both. Don't rely on just one. The practical changes they made to the system in those first weeks were small but significant. Moving rotation intervals from 4 days to 2.5. Adjusting the pen density so the birds were crowded enough to work the surface thoroughly, but not so crowded that they stressed. Adding a thin layer of wood chips ahead of each pen as they moved forward. Giving the birds organic material to scratch through and incorporating carbon into the nitrogen-heavy manure. Keeping detailed logs of each section, the date the pen moved on, what was planted behind it, the condition of the soil surface, the weather. June had always been systematic. With Martha's guidance, the system became precise. The first real sign that it was working came in early November, 6 weeks into the rotation on the garden beds. June was prepping a section for a winter cover crop. She was going to try a mix of winter rye and crimson clover, which would hold the soil through frost and fix nitrogen. And she dug a small test hole before planting, the way she always did, to check the soil condition. She pushed the probe in and felt the resistance change at a depth noticeably greater than 8 inches. She dug the hole by hand instead, and when she reached the boundary between the worked-over chicken section and the untouched ground adjacent to it, the difference was visible to the naked eye. On the chicken side, the soil was darker, not dramatically, not yet, but measurably, and looser, with visible crumbling and a slight earthy smell that the sterile clay had completely lacked. She found 3 earthworms in the first shovelful, which sounds like a small thing until you consider that she'd found 0 in the previous 2 months of sampling. She stood there in the November cold with dirt on her hands, looking at those 3 earthworms, and felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. It's working, not solved, not fixed, just working, moving in the right direction. The land was responding. She wrote it in the ledger that night. November 7th, Section 3, Bed 4. First earthworms observed. Soil darker, less compacted. Depth to hard pan increased approximately 2 inches over adjacent untreated section. Cover crop planted. The talk started in November. June had expected it. Holt County was not a large place, and there was not much new to talk about, and a woman alone putting 180 chickens on a failing farm in movable wire pens was genuinely unusual. What she hadn't quite anticipated was the speed at which the talk went from bemused to hostile. She was at the farm supply in town buying hardware cloth when she overheard it, not quite accidentally, Because two men were talking at a volume that suggested they didn't mind being overheard. Holloway girl, yeah, running some kind of chicken operation on her daddy's place. I heard, like a circus or something. Earl Pruitt says she bought 180 birds from Dale at the auction, straight run. She's got roosters waking up half the county. What's the point of it, chicken manure? That's what she says, moving them around on the fields, like a, what do you call it? Sounds like she's stalling. Waiting to lose the bank loan is what it sounds like. June paid for her hardware cloth and left without turning around. She was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her face. But she thought about it on the drive home, and she knew that the talk was going to be a problem. Not because of her feelings. She had, over the years, developed a fairly thick skin about what people said, but because talk in a small county had practical consequences. It shaped how officials responded to complaints. It influenced whether the bank gave you patience or pressure. It determined, sometimes, whether a neighbor helped you or let you fail. She was already on the margin of several important relationships. She didn't need public opinion turning against her before she had anything to show. Roland Mercer she knew by reputation before she met him. He'd left his card with her father twice in the last 2 years before her father died. She'd found them in the desk drawer, both with handwritten notes on the back. Call me, Jim. Let's talk options. He was one of 4 or 5 land investors in the region who made a business of buying struggling farms, offering fairish prices to people who were desperate, people who had no other options, people who didn't want to hold on and couldn't afford the luxury of choice. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even necessarily immoral. It was a business, and the business depended on people failing. She met him for the first time at a county extension office meeting in November, one of those quarterly informational sessions that June was attending because she'd heard there might be someone from the university agricultural program who could give her data on rotational grazing outcomes. Roland Mercer was in his late 50s, with the well-maintained look of a man who had money and cared about how money looked on him. Good boots, clean jacket. He had a way of standing slightly too close and asking questions that sounded like interest but felt like appraisal. "You're Jim Holloway's daughter," he said, materializing at her elbow during the coffee break. "June." "Yes, Roland Mercer." He shook her hand. His grip was firm, practiced. "I knew your father a little. Good man. Hard times on that property. We're working through it. I heard you've got a chicken operation going." He said chicken operation in the same tone you might say finger painting class. "Interesting approach." "It's a soil restoration system," June said. "The chickens are the mechanism, not the point." Right. He nodded as though she'd said something mildly interesting. "What's your timeline for the loan situation?" "January," she said, "and I'm not interested in selling if that's what you're working toward." He smiled, and there was nothing unpleasant about the smile except that it didn't change. "I'm just making conversation, June. We're all just neighbors out here." He paused. "But if things get difficult, I'll keep your card," she said, and walked away to find the university researcher. She found him, as it turned out, to be quite useful. His name was Dr. Vance Paulson, 40, slightly rumpled, with the distracted manner of someone whose mind was perpetually doing 3 things at once. He was working on a long-term study of soil restoration methods in degraded Missouri farmland, and he had, June discovered, heard of the specific methodology she was attempting. "The rotational pastured poultry system?" he said, his expression sharpening. "You're actually implementing that?" "On the garden beds right now. I'm planning to scale to the fields in spring." "How's your data looking?" "Come see," June said. He came the following week. He spent 3 hours on her property, taking samples, taking notes, asking questions that were more specific and useful than any questions she'd been asked in months. He looked at her ledger and said, with a quiet enthusiasm that felt more genuine than anything, "This is very well documented." "I'm a soil scientist," June said. "Or I was." "You still are," Paulson said. "You're just applying it differently." He looked out at the beds where the chickens were working the current section, scratching and pecking in their purposeful, oblivious way. "Can I come back with sampling equipment? I'd like to run my own baseline measurements so we have independent data." "Yes," June said. "Absolutely, yes." She walked home that evening feeling, for the first time in months, like she wasn't entirely alone in what she was doing. December arrived with the first real cold, which slowed the rotation and required June to add windbreaks to the pens and supplement the birds' foraging with grain. She moved them more carefully now, watching the weather, adjusting the schedule based on ground temperature and moisture. 3 birds died in the first hard freeze. She'd known there would be losses and had planned for them, and she noted it in the ledger and moved on. The cover crop she'd planted in October was up in the garden beds, a thin green bristle across the dark surface, and it was doing what cover crops were supposed to do, holding the soil in place, pulling nitrogen from the air and depositing it at root level, keeping the surface from crusting in the freeze-thaw cycles. She was out moving a pen on a gray Tuesday morning in mid-December when she heard a truck slow on the road and stop. She didn't look up immediately. She was dealing with a pen corner that had gotten stuck on a frozen clod of earth, and then she heard a voice that was not Harold Dunning's and not Donna Keyes's. "Ma'am." A county vehicle. She knew the logo without reading it, the Holt County seal on the door. The man who got out was middle-aged, in a department jacket, holding a clipboard. "June Holloway?" "Yes." "Dale Fickett, County Health Office." He looked at the pens, at the chickens, at the distance between them and the road. "We've had a complaint about an unlicensed poultry operation on this property. I need to take a look around." June straightened up. Her hands were cold and her back hurt, and it was 7:30 in the morning. "What kind of complaint?" Fickett consulted his clipboard. "Unsanitary conditions, odor nuisance, potential health risk to neighboring properties." She looked at him for a moment. He had the expression of a man doing a job he didn't particularly want to be doing, which was, in her experience, a reasonable basis for working with someone rather than against them. "Come on then," she said. "I'll show you everything." She walked him through all of it: the pen system, the rotation schedule, the distance from the road and from neighboring property lines. She showed him the ledger. She pointed out that the operation was on her own land, that the pens were moved frequently enough to prevent accumulation, that the cover crop established behind them was controlling erosion and preventing runoff. Fickett took notes. He was quiet for most of it, professional, not unfriendly. At the end, standing near the gate, he said, "The complaint came from a property owner in the county, not an adjacent neighbor. I want to be straight with you about that." "Did the complaint name who filed it?" June asked. Fickett glanced at his clipboard, then back at her. He didn't say anything, which was, in its way, an answer. She nodded. "What do I need to do to be in compliance?" "Based on what I've seen, you're within the guidelines for a small-scale agricultural operation. Under 50 breeding hens, the county doesn't require a commercial license, and your setup is rotational rather than stationary, so the waste management regulations read differently." He made a note. "I'll put in my report that the operation appears consistent with standard agricultural practice, but you should expect this won't be the last time someone calls." "I know," June said. "Thank you for being straight with me." After he left, June stood at the gate for a moment. The chickens were working the latest section, scratching away at the surface with their terrible efficiency, entirely indifferent to county health officials and loan deadlines and men with clipboards. She went back to work. Chad. By Christmas, she had rotated through 2/3 of the garden beds. The early sections, the ones the birds had worked in October, were showing something she could measure now, not just observe. She ran her own soil samples and compared them to the baseline she'd taken in September. Organic matter up by 1.2% in the primary beds. Microbial activity measurable where it had been essentially 0. Earthworm density increasing, pH shifting toward neutral. 1.2% organic matter might sound like almost nothing. In field soil science, it was enormous. It represented a genuine change in the biology of the ground, the beginning of a system that could sustain itself. She called Martha that evening. "First real data," she said, and read her the numbers. Martha was quiet for a moment. "That's in 2 months?" 2 months and 10 days. Another pause. "That's faster than I expected." "Me too." "Don't let it make you cocky," Martha said. "The spring will tell you more than the fall did. This ground has to hold through the frost cycles and come back right." "I know. But..." A pause, and June could hear something in Martha's voice that she didn't hear often, something like satisfaction. "It's a good start, June. It's a real good start." June sat at her father's kitchen table after she hung up, the yellow glow of the overhead light making the water stain on the ceiling look almost like a painting. And she looked at her ledger full of numbers and notes and soil measurements, and she thought about the 11 people at her father's graveside, and Hector Walsh talking about the loan before the prayer was finished, and Roland Mercer's smile that didn't change, and Harold Dunning looking at her truck full of chicks with the careful pity of someone watching a person make a mistake they can't prevent. She thought about her father's list on the refrigerator door. Things to fix someday. Not someday. Now. One section at a time, one rotation at a time, the chickens working steadily forward through the exhausted ground, the cover crops coming up behind them, the earthworms returning to soil that had forgotten what they were. Outside, the Missouri winter settled down hard and silent over 40 acres of land that was slowly and contrary to every prediction beginning to wake up. The January deadline came and went, and June was still there. She'd driven to Holt County Savings on the 2nd of January with $3,800 in her account, money from 4 months of contract soil testing work, money she'd earned in the evenings after dark when the chickens were settled and the pens were moved and she had nothing left to do but sit at the kitchen table under the Arkansas-shaped water stain and work through soil sample data for counties that weren't her own. It wasn't enough to clear the balance. It wasn't close. But it was enough to show Hector Walsh that the account was moving in a direction, and that she was serious, and that walking away from this loan was going to cost the bank more in paperwork and legal fees than giving her another 90 days was going to cost them in patience. Hector had looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man doing internal calculations. 90 days, he said finally. April 1st. June, I need something real by April. Not soil samples, money. April 1st, she agreed. She drove home with the weight of that deadline sitting on her chest like a stone, and did not allow herself to think about what April 1st would look like if the spring planting didn't produce. There was no productive use in that kind of thinking. The only productive use was the work, so she went back to the work. February in Holt County was brutal that year. 2 weeks of temperatures that dropped below zero at night and didn't get above 20 in the daytime, a stretch of cold that locked the ground and made the pen rotation slower and more difficult. The birds huddled together in the windbreaks she'd built from salvaged plywood and old feed sacks, and she supplemented their feed heavily to keep their body temperatures up, which cut into her margins in a way that made her spreadsheet look worse every week. 3 more birds died in the cold snap. She noted it without ceremony and moved on. Martha called on a Tuesday morning during the worst of it. How are the pens holding up? 2 of the corner latches on pen 4 cracked in the freeze, June said. I wired them for now. I'll rebuild them when it warms. The birds? Mostly okay. Lost 3 more, down to 161. That's within normal for winter pastured, Martha said. You losing sleep over it? I'm losing sleep over the April deadline. A pause. Come for dinner Friday. I want to show you something. What Martha wanted to show her was a set of yield records she'd kept from her market vegetable production over the past decade. Meticulous, handwritten, organized by section and season. She spread them on the kitchen table after dinner and pointed to a column of numbers from 2019, the year she'd run her duck rotation on the south beds. Look at the yield increase the season after the rotation, Martha said. That's not from inputs, that's from biology. The soil was alive and it fed the plants differently than amended but dead soil does. June studied the numbers. The difference was not subtle. In some crops, the post-rotation yield was 30–40% higher than the pre-rotation baseline. Your timeline, Martha said. The spring planting behind your October-November chicken sections. If the soil responded the way mine did, I'd have something to show the bank, June finished. You'd have something to show everybody, Martha said. She refilled her coffee cup. The question is what you plant. You need something that matures fast and commands a decent price. You don't have the luxury of a crop that takes all season. They talked through it for 2 hours. Early market vegetables, radishes, spinach, lettuces, which would be ready in 6 to 8 weeks from transplant, peas, which fixed their own nitrogen and would do well in the biologically active soil, a section of sweet corn planted slightly later, which would take longer but would give her a summer yield that could bring real money at the county farmers market if the ears were good. You'll need to get into the Carterville market, Martha said. I've got a spot I'm not using this year. My knees aren't up to the loading and unloading. You can have it. June looked at her. Martha, I can't take your market spot. You're not taking it, I'm giving it, Martha said, with the particular finality that meant the subject was settled. Don't be proud about it. Pride is a luxury for people who aren't 4 months behind on a bank loan. June laughed despite herself. It was the kind of laugh that came out slightly ragged, because it was carrying more than just amusement. "Thank you," she said. Martha waved it off. 7 in the morning, first Saturday in May. Don't be late. The good spots go to the people who set up before sunrise. Well, the thaw came in mid-March, tentative at first, and then decisive. The way Missouri springs always arrived. 1 week of mud and confusion, and then suddenly the ground was workable and everything had to happen at once. June was out before dawn on the first morning the soil gave under her boots without freezing, checking the sections the chickens had worked in October and November. She dug sample holes in each one, methodical, working down the row of beds, and what she found made her stop and stand very still for a moment in the early gray light. The soil in the earliest rotated sections was transformed in a way that 5 months ago she'd hoped for but hadn't quite let herself count on. Dark, loose, alive with the smell of active biology. That rich, complex earthiness that healthy soil had, and dead soil didn't. She pushed the depth probe in, and it sank to 14 inches before she hit resistance. 14 inches. In September, the same section had stopped at 8. She collected samples from 6 sections and drove them to the Extension Office lab that afternoon. She paid the rush fee without hesitating, which she normally wouldn't have done, but she needed the numbers and she needed them before she planted anything. The results came back Thursday. She read them at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, under the overhead light, and she went through them twice before she let herself accept what they said. Organic matter in the October sections, up from 0.8% to 2.1%, nearly tripled. Microbial biomass, significant and measurable across all sampled sections, where it had been essentially zero in September. Earthworm density, estimated at 42 per square meter in the primary beds, compared to a baseline count in September of fewer than 5. Cation exchange capacity, the soil's ability to hold and make available plant nutrients, up by a factor that meant the ground could now support crops without continuous chemical supplementation. She set down the report and looked at the window, which showed her nothing because it was dark outside, just her own reflection in the glass. It worked. Not as a theory, not as a possibility, as a documented, measurable, replicable fact. She called Martha. It was past 10, which she felt briefly guilty about, but Martha answered on the second ring. "The lab results came back," June said. "And?" She read her the numbers. Martha was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter, and something underneath the quiet that June recognized because she was feeling it herself. "June, that's not incremental, that's significant. I know. 2.1% organic matter in 6 months. Yeah. That would take 10 years with conventional amendments, maybe more." "I know," June said. Another silence. "You need to document this properly. Not just your ledger, independent documentation. Dr. Paulson, the university man, I'm calling him tomorrow." "Good." A pause. "Plant everything. Don't hold back sections for hedging. Put it all in." June looked at the results one more time. "I'm going to." She planted through the last 2 weeks of March and into April, working from before sunrise until her back wouldn't let her continue. And what she planted behind the chicken-worked sections came up differently than anything she'd planted in unrestored ground. She could see it within 2 weeks of germination. The seedlings in the restored beds were thicker-stemmed, darker green, growing with a density and vigor that the adjacent sections, planted at the same time with the same seed stock, simply didn't match. It wasn't magic. She knew exactly why it was happening. The biology was there. The nutrient cycling was functioning the way it was supposed to function in living soil. The plants were drawing on a reserve that hadn't existed 6 months ago. She knew the mechanism completely, but knowing the mechanism didn't make it any less extraordinary to stand at the edge of the bed in the morning light and watch it. Dr. Paulson came out on the first Wednesday of April with a graduate student and 2 crates of sampling equipment. He spent 4 hours on the property, going section by section, taking cores, measuring, photographing. June followed him and answered questions and showed him the ledger, which he photographed page by page. At the end, standing at the gate, he said, "I want to be careful not to overstate this before I've run the full analysis." He paused. "But June, this is unusual. The rate of restoration is... I've been studying degraded Missouri soil for 11 years, and I haven't seen this on a compressed timeline like this." "The chicken rotation," June said. "That's the variable. That's the variable, he agreed. I want to write this up. Would you consent to being part of a documented case study? Yes, June said. Whatever you need. Paulson nodded. He was already thinking ahead. She could see it. The academic version of what she'd been feeling since the lab results came back. The sense that something worth paying attention to was happening here. I'll have preliminary results back to you within 3 weeks. After he left, June went back into the fields to check the pea seedlings, which were up strongly in the earliest planted section, already reaching for the wire trellis she'd strung between salvaged fence posts. She ran her hand along a row of them and felt the quiet, irrational satisfaction of a thing growing the way it was supposed to grow. The talk in town had shifted by April. It was still talk, but the tone of it had changed in a way June noticed without anyone having to tell her about it directly. People who'd been politely skeptical were now something closer to curious. Harold Dunning had driven past her gate 3 times in 2 weeks, slowly, looking at the beds. He hadn't stopped, but the looking was different from the earlier looking. What hadn't changed, what was in fact sharpening, was Roland Mercer. She heard about it secondhand from Dale Fickett, of all people, who caught her at the Quick Stop in early April and said, with the careful neutrality of a man sharing information he thought she should have, "There's been some conversation at the county building about your operation. The health office, the agricultural extension office. Someone's been making calls." "Someone," June said. Fickett looked at his coffee cup. "I'm not in a position to say who, but I thought you should know it's not just coming from one direction. Whoever it is, they're working it from multiple angles." She thanked him and drove home, and that evening she called Martha and told her what Fickett had said. "Mercer," Martha said immediately. "That's my read too. He's not going to come at you directly. That's not how he operates." Martha was quiet a moment. "He tried the same thing with the Garrity farm 2 years ago. Walter Garrity had a drainage project that wasn't permitted correctly. It was a paperwork issue, nothing more, and Roland got someone at the county to treat it like an environmental violation. Walter was so exhausted fighting it that he sold." "Did Mercer buy the property?" "He had a cousin buy it, different name." A pause. "You need to get ahead of this, June. Whatever he's building, you don't want to be defending against it after it's already built." "What do you suggest?" "Call the county agricultural office yourself. Don't wait for them to call you. Ask them to come inspect. Frame it as a farmer seeking guidance, not a farmer responding to a complaint." Another pause. "And call Paulson. Ask if he can give you anything preliminary, even informal, even a letter. Something on university letterhead that documents what you're doing and what you're finding." June thought about it. "If I invite inspection before they come to me, I control the timing. You control more than that. You control what they see first." She called the county agricultural extension office the next morning. The person she spoke to was a woman named Karen Beal, who had the efficient, slightly cautious manner of someone accustomed to fielding calls that turned into problems. June introduced herself, explained that she was running a rotational pastured poultry system on her property, and said she'd like to have someone from the office come out and take a look. Not because she had concerns, but because she wanted the operation properly documented and wanted any guidance the county could provide. There was a brief silence. Then Karen Beal said, in a slightly different tone, "You're the Holloway property on Route 9? "That's right. We've had some inquiries about that property recently." "I know," June said. "That's partly why I'm calling. I'd rather you come out and see what's actually here than have you responding to second-hand reports." Another pause. "I can have our field examiner out next week." "Wednesday?" "Wednesday's fine," June said. "Tell him to come early. I want him to see the full rotation." She spent the days before Wednesday preparing, which was not falsifying or staging. The system was what it was, and the documentation was what it was. But she went through the ledger and organized it by section and date, created a summary sheet with the lab results and Paulson's preliminary findings, and put together a clear diagram of the rotation layout that anyone could follow without background knowledge. Martha came over Tuesday evening and looked through it. "This is good," Martha said, flipping through the summary sheet. "Clear, professional. You look like you know what you're doing." "I do know what I'm doing." "I know. But looking like it and being it are both necessary when someone's trying to make you look reckless." Martha handed it back. "One more thing. When this man comes, don't be defensive. Don't explain yourself before he asks. Show him. Let him ask questions. Answer them straight. The minute you start justifying, you sound like someone who has something to justify." I've done field inspections, June said. I know how to handle them. From the other side of the clipboard, Martha said. This is different. It was, in fact, somewhat different. The county field examiner was a man named Bill Archer, in his early 60s, who arrived Wednesday morning in a county truck with the careful, deliberate manner of a man who had seen a lot of agricultural operations and was not easily impressed in either direction. He shook June's hand, looked at the property without saying much, and then said, "Show me the system." She showed him. All of it. The pen construction, the rotation schedule, the cover crop management, the detailed logs. She walked him through the sections at various stages of the cycle, from the freshly bird-worked beds to the established crops coming up behind the earliest rotations. She pointed out the earthworm density without making a performance of it. She handed him the soil test results and let him read them without commentary. Archer was quiet through most of it, making occasional notes on his clipboard. He dug his own sample holes in 3 sections and looked at the soil with the same evaluative attention June used. At the end, at the gate, he said, "How many birds did you start with?" 180, down to 161 now, between predation and the winter losses. All on your own property? Everyone. You're moving them, what, every 2 to 3 days? 2 to 2.5 days, depending on weather and ground conditions. It's in the log. He looked at his notes. Your nearest neighbor's property line. East fence is 60 yards from the nearest pen. I've kept them west and central to the property intentionally. Archer nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone making a decision. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you. This office received a formal complaint characterizing your operation as an unsanitary hazard and a potential threat to neighboring water sources. I'm here because that complaint came through official channels, and I'm required to respond to it." He paused. "Having seen the operation, I can tell you that characterization is not supported by what's on the ground. This is within agricultural use guidelines. The rotation system actually reduces the accumulation concerns that a stationary operation would present." June kept her face neutral. "What happens next?" "I file my report. My report will reflect what I observed." He looked at her for a moment. "I'd suggest you request a copy of the report under the county records policy. Having it in your own files is useful." "I'll do that," she said. "Thank you." He drove away and June stood at the gate and looked out at the fields, at the pea trellises and the lettuce coming up in dark green rows and the chickens working the latest section with their oblivious industry, and she allowed herself about 30 seconds of pure cold anger at the situation, at the waste of it, the time and energy spent defending something that was working, that was genuinely working, against someone who wanted her to fail for reasons that had nothing to do with agriculture or health or the county's well-being. 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. The Carterville Farmers Market on the first Saturday of May was colder than it should have been for early May, a gray morning with a wind that had teeth in it, and June was there before 5 setting up Martha's spot, which was at the corner of the main row, good position, with foot traffic from both directions. She'd brought what she had. Bags of spinach, bunches of radishes, 3 varieties of lettuce, a flat of pea shoots that she'd cut that morning, and a small hand-lettered sign that said, "Holloway Farm, Holt County, restored soil, chemical-free." She didn't know if anyone would care about the sign. It turned out some people cared quite a lot. A woman stopped at 8:30, holding a coffee cup, and looked at the sign, then at the produce, then at June. Restored soil. "What does that mean?" June told her. "The short version. The depleted land, the chicken rotation, the soil biology coming back." The woman listened with the particular attention of someone filing information away for later. "Everything here grew in that soil?" "Yes." The woman bought 2 bags of spinach, a bunch of radishes, and the pea shoots. By 10 o'clock, June had sold out of spinach and was running low on lettuce. By noon, she had $340 in the cash box, which was more money from a single morning's work than she'd made in several weeks of contract testing. Martha appeared at noon, moving slowly with a cane that June hadn't seen her use before, and looked at the nearly empty table. "Good morning," Martha said. "Very good morning," June said. Martha picked up a remaining bunch of radishes and looked at it. The roots were dark red, the leaves still crisp and green, the kind of produce that showed in every visible way what the soil behind it had been. "They're beautiful," she said quietly. "The soil's doing it," June said. "Not me." "You did the soil," Martha said. She set the radishes down. Don't give away your credit. That's another thing women do too much of. June looked at her and didn't say anything. Martha, who had apparently said what she'd come to say, turned around and made her way slowly back through the market crowd. It was the week after the farmer's market when Roland Mercer made his move. June found out through Karen Beale at the extension office, who called her on a Tuesday morning with a careful, formal tone that told June before she said anything that whatever was coming wasn't casual. Ms. Holloway, I want to make you aware that a formal complaint has been filed through the County Commission requesting an official agricultural review of your operation. The complaint cites public health concerns, potential groundwater contamination, and characterizes the system as an unlicensed commercial poultry enterprise. June sat very still. Who filed the complaint? I can't disclose that. It's Roland Mercer, June said. Silence. The complaint will require a formal response from the county agricultural office and potentially an independent inspection by the state, Beale said. I'm informing you as a courtesy so you have time to prepare a response. When? The county commission meets in 3 weeks. The review would need to be completed before then. 3 weeks. June looked at the calendar on the wall. All right, she said. I appreciate the call. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. Through the window, she could see the early May fields, the peas up tall on their trellises, the second planting of lettuce coming in dense and dark, the chickens working the next section over, steady and methodical, doing what they'd been doing all winter, rebuilding ground that everyone had written off. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Paulson. The formal review, she said when he answered. How soon can you have something on paper? Paulson was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking. What's the timeline? 3 weeks. I can have preliminary findings in writing within 10 days. They won't be peer-reviewed, but they'll be from the university, with my credentials attached, and the data is solid. That's what I need. June. A pause. Whatever's driving this, the data is on your side. You know that. I know, she said. But data needs to be in the right hands at the right time, or it doesn't matter. She hung up and called Martha next, not to ask for advice this time, but to tell her what was happening, because Martha had earned the right to know. Martha listened without interrupting. When June finished, she said, What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure the county commission has every piece of documentation before Roland Mercer gets to frame the conversation, June said. Soil tests, field examiner's report, Paulson's preliminary findings, my own ledger records. I'm going to bury them in evidence before the first meeting. Martha was quiet for a moment. That's the right call. I'm also going to ask to present at the commission meeting myself, June said. Not through a lawyer, me in person. Can you do that? It's a public meeting. Anyone can address the commission. She paused. I'm not going to sit in the back and wait for someone else to tell them what's happening on my land. A longer pause from Martha. Then, No, I don't suppose you are. Outside the window, the chickens moved in their slow, patient rotation across the latest section of ground, scratching through the surface with their ridiculous, serious diligence, the way they had all winter, the way they would keep doing regardless of what got decided in county meeting rooms by men with clipboards and men with money and men with agendas that had nothing to do with what was actually growing in the dirt. The land was working. The numbers said so. The plants said so. And June Holloway, who had stood at her father's graveside in September with nothing but 40 acres of exhausted clay and a list of things that never got fixed, was not going to let anyone tell the county a different story than the one the soil itself was telling. The 10 days between June's phone call to Paulson and the county commission meeting were the longest 10 days she could remember since the week her father was in the hospital, and she'd sat in waiting rooms not knowing what came next. She worked through them the way she worked through most hard things, by staying in motion. The chickens still needed moving every 2.5 days. The pea trellises needed checking after a wind came through on the Thursday and knocked 2 of the posts sideways. The second lettuce planting needed thinning, which was the kind of slow, crouching work that made her lower back ache by evening, but which couldn't be skipped or it would cost her the whole row. She did all of it, and she kept the ledger current, and she answered Paulson's follow-up questions by phone in the evenings. And underneath all of it ran a constant low current of tension that she couldn't quite turn off, even in sleep. She dreamed twice about the county commission meeting. In the dream, she was standing at the podium, and Roland Mercer was in the audience, smiling his fixed smile. And when she opened her mouth to speak, nothing came out. Not because she was afraid, but because the room was filling with water, slowly, from the floor up, and nobody in the room seemed to notice except her. She didn't tell Martha about the dream. She told Martha about the documents. Paulson sent the preliminary report Thursday, June said. They were in Martha's kitchen, the way they often were on Friday evenings now, which had become a working dinner without either of them officially naming it as such. Martha had made soup from the last of her winter squash, and it was good in the way that food made by someone who has been cooking for 40 years is good. Not complicated, just exactly right. "What does it say?" Martha asked. 6 pages. University letterhead, his credentials, the methodology, the sample results, and a section at the end that June paused, finding the words. He calls it a statistically significant restoration of soil biological function in a compressed time frame using integrated pastured poultry rotation. He says the results are inconsistent with degradation and inconsistent with any of the contamination concerns raised in the complaint. Martha ladled soup into both bowls without looking up. In plain language? In plain language, he's saying the complaint is not supported by the science. Good. Martha sat down across from her. What else do you have? Archer's field report from April. My own soil test results from March, and then again from 2 weeks ago. I ran a second round after the complaint was filed, wanted current numbers. The ledger. Photographs I've been taking since October, dated and labeled by section. Martha picked up her spoon. The photographs were smart. I've been taking them every time I move a pen, before and after each section. It's not dramatic in any individual image, but if you put them in sequence, you can literally watch the soil color change. Martha looked at her. You're going to show those at the meeting? I'm going to show everything at the meeting, June said. I'm asking for 15 minutes. The commission chair told me I have 10, but I'm going to need 15, and I think once I start, nobody's going to stop me. There was a pause. The soup steamed between them. Roland will have someone there, Martha said. He won't present himself. He'll have someone to raise the objections for him. I know. Don't engage with whoever it is. Don't look at them when they speak. Keep your attention on the commissioners. I know how to present data, June said. I've done it in front of corporate clients and university review boards. This is different, Martha said. In those rooms, you were the expert they hired. In this room, you're the person they've had complaints about. She looked at June steadily. The commissioners know Roland. They've known him for years. He's had dinner with most of them. June stirred her soup. I know. So this isn't just about the data being correct. The data has to be so clear and so documented that they can't give him the benefit of the doubt without looking like they're ignoring science in front of their own county record. That's exactly what I'm building, June said. Martha nodded once. Then build it well. Paulson called Sunday evening with something June hadn't expected. I spoke with my department chair today, he said. There was a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before. Careful, slightly formal, like he was measuring words. He reviewed the preliminary report. He wants to send a second researcher to your property before the commission meeting, someone with credentials in environmental science who can independently corroborate the contamination assessment, or rather, the lack of it. June sat up straighter. When? Monday morning, if you're available. I'm available. Her name is Dr. Rena Sath. She's been doing groundwater and agricultural runoff studies for 8 years. If she can look at your drainage patterns, your proximity to neighboring water sources, and give an independent statement that the contamination claim isn't supported, that closes the environmental angle, June said. That's the angle I was most worried about. That's why Marcus, my chair, wants her there. The soil biology case is solid. The contamination claim is vaguer and harder to dismiss without someone specifically credentialed in that area. Tell her 7 in the morning, June said. I'll have coffee. She spent that evening rewalking the property's drainage in her head. The land sloped very gently south toward a low seasonal creek that ran along the south fence line, and in a wet spring there was surface water movement in that direction. She'd been aware of it since October, and had kept the pens deliberately north and west of the slope for precisely that reason. The drainage documentation was in the ledger. But drainage documentation made by the farmer whose operation was under complaint was one thing. An independent environmental scientist making the same assessment was something else entirely. Dr. Sath arrived Monday at 7:15, driving a car with university plates, and she turned out to be a compact, precise woman in her 40s who said almost nothing for the first hour and asked very specific questions for the second. She walked the drainage patterns with a surveying instrument June didn't recognize and took water samples from the seasonal creek. She looked at the pen placement relative to the slope. She examined the cover crop establishing over the previously chicken-worked sections and noted the erosion control it provided. At the end, at the gate, she said, "I'm going to be direct." "Please," June said. "The contamination claim is not credible. Your pen placement is well back from the slope. The cover crop on the worked sections is doing exactly what cover crops are supposed to do in terms of preventing nutrient runoff. The creek sample I'm taking today is a baseline, and I can run it for nitrogen and coliform, but based on what I've seen on this property, I would be surprised if it showed anything outside normal agricultural parameters." She paused. "I'll have written findings by Wednesday." "The commission meeting is Friday," June said. "Wednesday," Dr. Sath confirmed. "I'll email directly." But the 10 days collapsed into the 3 days before the meeting, and the 3 days collapsed into the night before, and June sat at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock with everything spread in front of her. Paulson's report, Sath's water analysis, Archer's field report, her own soil test results in chronological order, the photo sequence in a binder she'd put together with dated labels. And she went through her presentation one more time. 15 minutes. She'd timed it. It ran 16 and a half. She cut 2 minutes from the soil science explanation, which was the part most likely to lose a non-specialist audience anyway, and replaced it with the photograph sequence because images of visible soil change were more immediate than numbers. She kept Paulson's language on the biological restoration because the university authority mattered. She ended with Sath's water findings because the contamination allegation was the most serious and deserved the final word. She practiced it standing up, in the kitchen, speaking to the Arkansas-shaped stain on the ceiling. Her voice was steady the first time through. The second time, it wavered slightly at the part where she explained how long the property had been in her family, which she hadn't intended to include and then found herself including anyway. Her father's 60 years on this land, the debt he'd left, the list of things to fix that never got fixed. And she stood there for a moment with her notes in her hand, deciding whether to cut it or keep it. She kept it. Not for sentiment, because it was true, and because the truth of it, a woman not letting her family's land die of neglect and debt, not walking away, not selling to the man who wanted it, was relevant context that no data set could fully carry. She went to bed at midnight and slept, to her own surprise, reasonably well. Teats. The Holt County Commission met in a building that served as the county record office, the commission chamber, and on alternate Thursdays, the public library overflow space. It was a low brick building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and the faint institutional smell of old paper and floor wax. June arrived 20 minutes early, which meant she arrived before most of the commissioners. She sat up at the presentation table. Copies of the documentation package for each commissioner. She'd made 7 copies, 1 per commissioner plus 2 for the record. Her binder of photographs. Her notes. People filtered in. A few faces she recognized from the Carterville market. Harold Dunning, who surprised her by being there at all, came in with his wife and sat near the back. Karen Beal from the extension office took a chair along the wall rather than at the main table, which meant she was there as an observer, not a participant. Dr. Paulson had driven up from the university and was sitting in the second row, which June noticed and which meant something to her, though she didn't look at him more than once. Roland Mercer was not there. What was there in the third row was a man June didn't recognize, well-dressed, with a legal pad, who had the careful stillness of someone who had come to listen first and act second. She took note of him and then put him out of her mind the way Martha had advised. The commission chair, a woman named Sandra Cutler, called the meeting to order at 9 in the morning and went through 2 routine county items before getting to the complaint. She read the formal language of it, the allegations of unsanitary conditions, potential groundwater contamination, unlicensed commercial enterprise. In the brisk tone of someone reading aloud something they find administratively necessary, but not personally convincing. "We have a presentation from the property owner," Sandra Cutler said. "Ms. Holloway, you have the floor." June stood up. She had given presentations before, to agricultural companies, to university extension programs, to clients who were skeptical and needed convincing. She knew the particular quality of attention in a room full of people who hadn't decided yet what they thought, and she knew how to work with it rather than against it. She started with the photographs, not the soil data, not the university reports, the photographs in sequence beginning with September, The pale, dusty clay of the East Garden beds, the crumbling surface with no cohesion, the test hole showing 8 inches to hard pan. And moving forward month by month, the chickens working the sections, the cover crops establishing, the spring beds coming up with that unmistakable density and color of plants growing in living soil. She didn't narrate it heavily. She let the images carry it. By the third-month sequence, she could feel the room's quality of attention change, the particular stillness of people who are looking at something they didn't expect to see. By March, she said, independent soil sampling from the University Agricultural Program showed organic matter up from 0.8% to 2.1% in the primary sections, earthworm density from fewer than 5 per square meter to over 40, depth to hardpan from 8 inches to 14. She put Paulson's report on the screen. Dr. Vance Paulson, University of Missouri Agricultural Research Program, is in this room today if the commission has questions for him. She watched 2 commissioners turn to look at Paulson. He nodded. She moved to Archer's report. Read the relevant passage. The characterization that the operation was consistent with standard agricultural practice within county guidelines for small-scale agricultural use, and that the rotation system actively reduced the waste accumulation concerns associated with stationary poultry operations. This assessment was made by your own county field examiner, she said. It's in your own county records. Then she put up Dr. Sath's water analysis. The contamination allegation is the most serious claim in the complaint, she said. I want to address it directly, and I want to address it with independent environmental science, not with my own word. She summarized Sath's findings, the drainage assessment, the pen placement, the cover crop erosion control, the creek sample results, which had come back Wednesday morning showing nitrogen and coliform levels within normal agricultural parameters. Doctor, Sath's full findings are in your documentation package. She paused. The room was very quiet. I want to be clear about what this property is, she said, and here she let herself say the part she'd been uncertain about. My father farmed this land for 60 years and died in September with 40 acres of exhausted soil and more debt than he could pay. I came back to that land because it was mine. Not because it was easy. It wasn't. Not because anyone encouraged me. They didn't. I borrowed money I didn't have and built a system that I believed could work, and I documented every stage of it, and I invited your county field examiner to inspect it before I had anything definitive to show. And I invited the university to study it, and I invited Dr. Sath to assess the environmental concerns independently. I have done everything you would ask a responsible farmer to do. The record shows it. She gathered her notes. The complaint before you is not about health or safety or water quality. Those concerns have been independently assessed and found unsupported. What the complaint is about, I'll leave for this commission to consider. She looked at Sandra Cutler. Thank you for the time. She sat down. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. The man in the third row. She learned later his name was a property attorney named Gerald Foss. And yes, he had been retained by a development firm with ties to Roland Mercer's operation. Stood up after June sat down and made a statement about the inadequacy of a preliminary university report and the insufficient timeline of the environmental assessment and the general principle that a formal investigation should not be preempted by evidence assembled by the party under review. He was smooth and he was technically coherent and he was completely wrong, and June watched Sandra Cutler's face while he spoke. Sandra Cutler was a former county agronomist who had spent 20 years evaluating soil and water claims before she ran for commission, which was something June had learned from Karen Beal the day before the meeting, which was why she had structured the presentation the way she had. Heavy on independent scientific authority, light on personal appeal. When Foss finished, Sandra Cutler said, "The environmental assessment was conducted by a university researcher with 8 years of specialized credentials. The soil findings are from the same institution. The county's own field examiner found the operation within guidelines." She looked at the other commissioners. "I'm going to move that the county adopt the field examiner's existing report as the official record on this property, and that the formal complaint be noted as reviewed and not substantiated." She looked at Foss. "The commission appreciates the concerns raised. They have been addressed." It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no gavel. Sandra Cutler simply moved to the next agenda item, and the fluorescent lights hummed above the folding chairs, and June sat very still for a moment and looked at her hands on the table and felt the stone that had been sitting on her chest since April lift, Not completely, but enough to breathe differently. Paulson appeared at her elbow as people were filing out. "That was well done," he said quietly. "The data was well done," June said. "I just presented it." "Don't give away your credit," he said, which was almost exactly what Martha had said about the radishes at the market, and June looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Harold Dunning stopped her near the door. He had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it slightly, the way men in Holt County handled things they weren't sure how to say. "June," he said. He looked at the hat. "I should have come by in February to help with the pen repair. I saw those corners needed work." "Harold, I want to come see what you've got growing," he said. "If that's all right, I'd like to see it." She looked at him. He was 60-something, and he'd farmed his whole life and watched her father farm badly for 60 years, and he was standing in the county building holding his hat because he didn't know how to say he'd been wrong about something. "Come Saturday," she said. "Early. I'll show you everything." He nodded, put the hat back on. "I'll be there." But she found out about Roland Mercer's response secondhand, the same way she found out about most things. Through the particular small county telegraph that ran through the Quick Stop and the farm supply and the Saturday farmers market. Dale Fickett called her Thursday morning. "Thought you'd want to know. Mercer was at the county building yesterday afternoon." "Doing what?" "Talking to some of the commission staff. I don't know what he said, but I saw him in the hallway outside Sandra Cutler's office for about 20 minutes. A pause. "She didn't let him in." June took a moment with that. "Good." "Yeah." Another pause. "You did good in there Wednesday." "The science did good," she said, which was only partly true. The science had given her the foundation. She had built the structure on top of it herself, in her father's kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, timing herself against a water stain on the ceiling, cutting 2 minutes here and adding a photograph there, figuring out which truth to say out loud and which to leave the commissioners to arrive at on their own. She went out that afternoon to move the pens. The birds were into a new section on the north field now, the first significant acreage beyond the garden beds, and the rotation was scaling up the way she'd hoped since March, but hadn't been sure until she had the spring data. The north field soil was in worse shape than the garden beds had been. Deeper compaction, lower organic matter starting point. But the system was better now too, the intervals refined, the density adjusted, her reading of each section's condition sharper than it had been in October when she was still guessing at half of it. She dragged the pen forward on its skids and watched the birds move into the fresh section with the intensity they always brought to new ground, scratching and pecking with no awareness of county commission meetings or formal complaints or men with legal pads, entirely committed to the work of being chickens on ground that needed exactly what chickens could give it. June straightened up and looked north across the field. The peas on their trellises had reached the tops of the wires now, the pods beginning to swell. The lettuce in the south beds was ready to cut again. Her third harvest from those beds, which had produced more consistently and more densely than any lettuce she'd grown in unrestored soil. The cover crop she'd planted first in October had winter-killed and broken down into the surface, and was feeding the spring plantings now, invisible but present, the way most of what actually sustained things tended to be. She thought about her father's list on the refrigerator. She hadn't looked at it in a while. It was still there. She hadn't taken it down, hadn't moved it. Some things she kept not because they were useful, but because they were true. He hadn't fixed any of it, but he'd stayed all those years on ground that never quite worked back. And maybe there was something in that staying that she'd inherited along with the debt and the 40 acres of clay. Not the failing, the staying. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Paulson. A text. Department chair wants to discuss a full research partnership on the property. Formal study, multi-season. Can you talk this week? She stood in the north field with the sun going sideways through the afternoon and read it twice. A full research partnership meant resources she didn't have. It meant independent documentation that no complaint and no county meeting could override. It meant that whatever she was building here, whatever the chickens and the cover crops and the 16 months of ledger entries were adding up to, would be part of a record that outlasted the immediate fight and became something else, something larger than one woman's 40 acres. She typed back, "Yes. Call tomorrow morning." Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to moving the pen, because the birds were waiting and the section needed working and there was still 2 hours of light left in the day. The formal research partnership agreement arrived by email on a Tuesday morning in late May, 12 pages of university language that June read twice at the kitchen table before forwarding it to a lawyer in Carterville she'd used once before for a contract dispute. The lawyer called back the same afternoon. "It's straightforward," he said. "They're asking for access to the property for data collection over 3 growing seasons. You retain full ownership and operational control. They supply equipment, labor for sampling, and academic documentation. You get copies of everything they produce." "Any publication rights issues?" "They have first publication rights on the research findings. You're acknowledged as the originating farmer and retain the right to share your own operational data independently." A pause. "June, this is a good agreement. They want what you have. They're not trying to take it." She signed it that Friday and sent it back. What happened over the following 6 weeks was something she hadn't quite prepared herself for, which was the particular experience of having people with advanced degrees and expensive equipment arrive on your property and treat what you'd built with a seriousness that still, even now, caught her slightly off guard. Not because she doubted the work, she'd believed in it since the earthworms came back in November, but because there was a difference between knowing something was real and watching 4 researchers from 2 institutions move through your fields with soil cores and data loggers, documenting it as real. Paulson came every week. Dr. Sath returned twice more for water monitoring. A third researcher named Jeff Calloway, who specialized in agricultural economics, showed up in June and spent a day walking the property and reviewing her production records, asking questions about input costs and market returns that were more uncomfortable to answer honestly than the soil science questions, because the economics were still tight and she knew it. "Your input costs are high relative to your output value at this stage," Calloway said, not unkindly, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with a spreadsheet on his laptop. "But that's typical of a restoration phase. You're investing in soil capital that will pay out over multiple seasons." "I know," June said. "The question is whether I can stay solvent long enough to get to those seasons." "How's the loan situation?" She told him. April 1st had come and she'd made a payment. Not the full balance, but enough, combined with the spring market sales, to keep Hector Walsh from calling the loan. The April market had been better than March. The May market had been better than April. She was not out of trouble, but she was moving. Calloway made a note. "Your market premium for the chemical-free restored soil claim, are buyers responding to that?" "Some of them. The woman who bought the first spinach in May, she's come back every Saturday. She brings people." June paused. "Word of mouth is working, but the county market is limited. I need either a larger market or a direct relationship with a restaurant or grocer." "I can put you in contact with someone," Calloway said. "There's a regional food buyer I work with who sources from small farms. She's been looking for Missouri producers who can document their growing practices." June looked at him. "You'd do that?" "You have the documentation," he said, as if it were obvious. "That's what she needs. A farm with a story it can prove." The meeting with the food buyer, her name was Carol Driscoll, based in Kansas City, happened by phone a week later. It lasted 45 minutes and covered soil testing protocols, production volume, growing calendar, and delivery logistics. Carol Driscoll asked specific questions in the manner of someone who had been misled by farmers before and had stopped giving the benefit of the doubt. "You can provide independent soil certification?" she said. "University documentation from an ongoing research study," June said. 3 researchers, multi-season commitment." A brief silence. "That's more than I usually get." "I know. What's your sweet corn volume looking like this summer?" "First harvest in late July. I have a 1/4 acre in the restored sections. Based on current plant density and vigor, I'm projecting better than average yields, possibly significantly better." She paused. "I won't promise you numbers I can't back up, but I can send you the plant assessment data and you can make your own projection." Carol Driscoll said she'd think about it, which turned out to mean she called back the next morning with a trial order for 8 weeks of market vegetables starting in July, with an option to expand to sweet corn if the harvest met quality standards. June hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, not moving, and then she went outside because she needed air, and the kitchen felt suddenly very small. Harold Dunning came on a Saturday morning in early June, as he'd said he would, and he was different than June had expected him to be about it. Not patronizing, not reluctant, but genuinely quiet in the way of someone who was actually looking rather than confirming what he already thought he knew. She walked him through the full rotation, the Northfield sections where the birds were currently working. The established beds in the south where the third planting was coming up. She showed him the depth comparison, dug 2 holes side by side, one in a chicken-rotated section and one in the adjacent unrestored ground, and let him see the difference himself. Harold crouched over the holes for a long time without saying anything. He put his hand in the restored soil and worked it through his fingers the way farmers do, feeling the texture, the moisture, the break of it. "That's not the same ground," he said finally. "Same ground," June said, different biology." He looked up at her. "How long?" 8 months on this section, less on the newer ones. He stood up slowly, with the effort of a man whose knees had opinions about crouching. 8 months, he said. He looked out across the field, at the chickens working the current section, at the cover crop established behind them, at the trellised peas that were finishing their season, and the sweet corn that had come up strong in the early June warmth. "I've been farming for 40 years, he said. "Never seen turnaround like that." "It's the biology," June said. "The birds are just the delivery mechanism. What they're delivering is a functioning soil ecosystem." Harold was quiet for a moment. "My East 40, he said. "I've had trouble with it for 6-7 years. Compaction from the machinery. Yields dropping every season." He paused. "I put more fertilizer on it last year than I've ever put on any piece of ground, and it still came in 20% under where it should have been." June looked at him. He wasn't asking a question exactly. He was doing something more careful, working his way toward a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "Tell me about the East 40, she said. He did. She listened. By the end of it, she had a reasonable picture of the problem. The compaction, the chemical dependence, the declining microbial activity. And she had a reasonable idea of what a rotational system on that ground would need to look like. "I can't do your 40 for you," she said. "I've got my own restoration to finish and the research schedule on top of it. But I can sit down with you and look at the layout and tell you what I'd try." Harold turned his hat over in his hands. "I'd appreciate that." "And Harold," she said, "you need to think about whether you're willing to hold a section out of production for a season. The restoration timeline requires it. You can't run the rotation and also expect full yield from those sections simultaneously." He made a face that she understood. It was the face of a man calculating what a season's lost yield cost against what continuing to decline cost and finding neither number comfortable. "I know," she said. "It's a hard ask." "It's a fair ask," he said. "I just need to sit with it." She made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours with a map of his property and her ledger and a fresh legal pad, and she walked him through the system in the kind of practical detail that was different from how she'd explained it to Paulson or to the county commission. Not scientific framing, but farmer framing, which was about weather windows and equipment realities, and the specific stubbornness of particular pieces of ground that had been farmed the same way for too long. Harold asked good questions. He pushed back on 2 of her suggestions with reasoning she had to take seriously, and she adjusted the proposal on that basis. By the time he left, something had shifted between them that wasn't quite acknowledged but was present. The particular shift that happened when 2 people stopped talking around something and started talking about it directly. The sweet corn came in the last week of July. June had known intellectually from the plant assessments she'd been running all season that it was going to be a strong harvest. The stalk density was high. The ear development had been tracking ahead of the growth tables she was using as reference, and the soil moisture retention in the restored sections had been holding steadier through the July heat than unrestored ground typically did. Knowing it intellectually and standing in front of it were different things. The ears were large, significantly larger than the seed company's standard yield projection, and they were uniform in a way that restored soil crops tended to be, the plants having had access to a balanced and self-sustaining nutrient cycle rather than the spiky feast or famine chemistry of synthetic fertilization. She harvested a sample row and took it to Martha before she took it anywhere else, because that felt like the right order of things. Martha shucked an ear at the kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment. She said. "That's all." "What do you want me to say?" Martha ran her thumb along the rows of kernels. "It's beautiful corn, June. You know it is." "I wanted you to say so." Martha looked at her with the expression she used when she thought June was being slightly foolish about something but was willing to allow it. "It's beautiful corn. It grew in soil you rebuilt with your own hands in 8 months. Is that enough?" "Yes," June said. "That's enough." She delivered the first order to Carol Driscoll's distribution point in Carterville that Thursday. Sweet corn, a second run of lettuce, the last of the summer squash, and Carol Driscoll inspected it with the practiced eye of a buyer who had been doing this long enough to know quality from presentation, and she said, "This is what I was hoping for," which from Carol Driscoll, June was coming to understand, was approximately equivalent to anyone else saying this is extraordinary. The trial order became a standing arrangement. Roland Mercer called her in early August. She almost didn't answer. She was in the North Field moving pens, and her phone was in her pocket, and she saw his name on the screen and had a brief, strong impulse to let it ring through to voicemail. Then she answered, because she was curious, and because she had learned over the past year that it was better to hear things directly than secondhand. "June," he said, "Roland Mercer. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I'm in the field. What do you need, Roland?" A pause. Either he hadn't expected that directness, or he was calibrating his approach. "I've been hearing things about what you've got going on over there. The university study, the market arrangement. Word gets around." "It does." Another pause. "I want to be straight with you. I misjudged the situation. Early on, when you first started, I thought—" He stopped. She heard him exhale. "I thought you were stalling, running out the clock on the loan. That's how it looked from the outside." "I know how it looked," June said. "I was wrong about that." She waited. There was more coming. Roland Mercer didn't call people to apologize for being wrong. "I have 3 properties in this county," he said, "and 2 in the next county over. All of them acquired from farmers who were dealing with exactly what your father was dealing with. Soil that wouldn't produce, debt they couldn't service, no clear path forward. I bought those properties because I thought they were past saving." Another pause. "I'm not certain that's true anymore." June stopped walking. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'd like to come out and see what you've got. And I'm saying that and I want to be clear, this is an offer, not a demand. I'm saying I'd be willing to renegotiate the terms on your father's loan, lower the interest rate, extend the timeline." She stood in the north field, the phone against her ear, the chickens working 20 yards ahead of her. "Why?" "Because I was wrong about what's possible on this land, and I'd like to act accordingly. It wasn't a full admission. It wasn't the complete truth of what he'd done. The complaints, the attorney at the county meeting, the pressure on Hector Walsh that she suspected but couldn't prove. It was a partial truth wrapped in practical interest, because Roland Mercer had seen the university study and the market arrangement and was now calculating that June Holloway's farm had more value productive than failed. She knew that. She weighed it against the practical reality that a lower interest rate and an extended timeline on the loan was something she needed, regardless of who was offering it. "You can come out next week," she said, "Tuesday afternoon, and you can bring farmers, Roland. If you have properties with depleted soil and people who are struggling with it, bring them here first before you make decisions about what's possible." A pause. "You'd do that?" "I'd do that," she said, "because better farms are better for everyone in this county. Including you, if you think about it long enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Tuesday," he said. "I'll call ahead." She put the phone in her pocket and went back to moving the pen, because the birds were waiting and the section needed working and the north field wasn't going to restore itself. Chet. Roland came on Tuesday with 2 men she didn't know, farmers from the adjacent county, both of them visibly cautious, in the manner of people who have been brought somewhere by someone they half trust to look at something they half believe. June showed them what she showed everyone: the rotation sequence, the soil comparison holes, the ledger, the research documentation. She showed them the yield records from the market season and the sweet corn harvest data. One of the men, his name was Pete Garver, mid-50s, with the sunburned neck and careful hands of someone who had been working ground his whole life, crouched over the soil comparison holes the same way Harold had, and was quiet the same way Harold had been quiet. "What kind of chickens?" he said finally. "Rhode Island Reds, mostly. Some mixed breeds. I started with straight-run birds because they were cheapest." "And you built the pens yourself?" "With scrap lumber and hardware cloth. I can show you the construction." Pete Garver looked at his companion, a quieter man named Dennis, who had said very little and was clearly doing the kind of arithmetic in his head that June recognized. The arithmetic of a man measuring what he had against what he needed and finding the gap. "What it cost you," Pete said. "To start, $14.40 for the first birds," June said. "The pen lumber was free. Hardware cloth was around $200. Everything else was labor. She paused. The real cost was time, and the willingness to hold sections out of production while you're restoring them. How long before you saw results you could sell? 7 months to the first farmer's market, 8 months to the first university-confirmed data. About 10 months before I was making enough from the restored sections to matter. Pete Garver turned his hat over in his hands, the same gesture Harold had made, and June wondered if it was something they taught in some unofficial school for Holt County farmers, the hat turning as a mechanism for processing information that was more hopeful than you'd let yourself expect. Roland had been standing back during all of this, saying almost nothing, which was different from how he'd been at the county extension meeting in November when he'd had opinions about everything. June noticed it. She wasn't sure what it meant exactly, but it was different. At the end, at the gate, Roland looked at her and said, "The interest rate. I was thinking we bring it down from 7 to 4 and extend the payoff period by 18 months. June had already decided to accept before she said, 4.5. And I want it in writing by Friday. He looked at her for a moment. 4.5. And the 18-month extension. Agreed, he said. He put his hand out. She shook it. His grip was the same as when she'd met him at the extension office meeting in November, practiced, firm. But something in the rest of him was different in a way she couldn't quite name. Not humbled, exactly. Roland Mercer was not a man who humbled easily, but adjusted, recalculated. Pete Garver shook her hand too before he got in Roland's truck, and he said, "I might call you, if that's all right." "Call me," June said. Paulson came out the third week of August for what he called the mid-season documentation review, which meant an afternoon of sampling and an evening of going through the cumulative data at the kitchen table. He had a graduate student with him named Lily, who was writing her thesis on integrated livestock crop systems, and who looked at June's ledger with the particular reverence of a young researcher encountering primary data that was cleaner and more complete than she had any right to expect. "You kept this from the very first day?" Lily said. "September 12th, June confirmed. First entry is the baseline soil sample from the East Garden beds." "The baseline numbers are—" Lily stopped herself. "I'm sorry. It's just that a lot of farmers who agree to research studies don't have pre-intervention data. They start recording when the researchers arrive. Your baseline gives us something to compare against that most studies don't have." "I ran soil tests before I started because I needed to know what I was working with," June said. "I didn't do it for the research." "I know. That's why it's valuable." Lily looked at the ledger. "Can I photograph the whole thing? All the way through?" "You can have a copy," June said. "I'll photocopy every page." Paulson looked up from his laptop. "June, the preliminary findings I presented at the spring conference, the response was significant. 2 researchers from the agricultural program at Iowa State reached out, one from Kansas. There's genuine interest in replicating the study on other degraded soil types in the region." June looked at him. "How do you mean, replicating?" "Using your system as the model, not just studying what you've done here, adapting it to other farms with similar degradation profiles and running parallel studies." He paused. "Your rotation protocol, your pen design, your interval calculations, it's a complete and documented methodology. Other researchers want to test whether it's generalizable." She sat with that for a moment. The particular weight of it. What had started in September as a desperate gamble, 1 woman, 180 unwanted chicks, 40 acres of worn-out clay, had become, in 11 months, a methodology. A thing other researchers wanted to replicate. A thing with the weight of institutional interest behind it. "What do you need from me for that to happen?" she said. "A write-up of the protocol in plain language. Not academic, practical. Something a farmer can read and implement, with your measurements and your intervals and your adjustments for weather and soil type." He paused. "Essentially, the ledger in narrative form. Your voice, not ours." June thought about her father's list on the refrigerator. Things to fix someday. She thought about the 11 people at the graveside. She thought about Dale Fickett's face in the quick-stop doorway, saying, "I thought you should know." She thought about Martha saying, "Don't give away your credit." "I'll write it," she said. The summer ended the way good summers in Missouri ended. Slowly, the heat releasing its grip degree by degree through September. The field shifting color, the last of the sweet corn finished and the fall crops establishing in the sections the chickens had worked through August. The birds were into the far north end of the property now, the last sections they hadn't reached yet, ground that was still pale and compacted and offering very little. Ground that would spend the winter under cover crop and begin its change the same way everything else had begun, invisibly, below the surface, where the biology worked on its own schedule regardless of what anyone thought about it. Martha's cane was permanent now, not occasional, and she moved more slowly than she had in October when she'd shown up at the gate and told June her rotation intervals were too long. June had started driving to Martha's for their Friday dinners rather than the other way around, and she did the dishes after, which Martha accepted without comment, but also without objection, which was the closest Martha came to acknowledging that she needed something. One Friday evening in September after dinner, Martha said, "How many people have come to look at the farm this summer?" June thought about it. Harold, Pete Garver, and Dennis. They came back a second time on their own. The two university researchers. Roland with 3 different groups of people. Dale Fickett brought his nephew. A woman from the county soil conservation office. She paused. Maybe 20 people total. Martha nodded. More next year. Probably. You need to think about how you structure that. You can't just let people wander in and out and also run the operation and also do the research documentation. Martha turned her coffee cup. You need a day, a scheduled day each month where people can come and you show them everything at once. June looked at her. Like a field day. Like a field day. Farmers do them. Universities do them. You have something worth showing. Structure it so it doesn't eat your week every time someone calls. It was the kind of practical, unglamorous advice that Martha always gave. The kind that cut straight to what was actually needed rather than what sounded good. And June wrote it down on the legal pad she kept on the table and put a star next to it. Outside, the September evening was settling over the fields, the light going gold and then gray, and somewhere in the north end of the property, the last rotation of the season was working ground that didn't know yet what it was going to become. The same ground that had seemed past saving a year ago, that a reasonable person would have walked away from, that everyone had already written off in their heads before June had even had a chance to start. The farm was not finished, it was not perfect, and it was not without its remaining difficulties. The loan balance still existed, the North Field restoration would take another full season at minimum, and there were problems she hadn't solved yet, and probably problems she hadn't encountered yet. The work was not done because work like this was never entirely done. But the ground was alive, and the market was real, and the ledger was full, and the people who had laughed at the chicken circus in October were the same people who were calling in September to ask if they could come and look. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. The first field day happened on a Saturday in early April, 14 months after June had loaded 180 chicks into the back of her father's truck and driven home on Route 9 with no certainty about anything except that she was going to try. She'd put a notice in the county agricultural newsletter and a handwritten flyer on the board at the farm supply in town. She'd expected maybe 15 people. 31 showed up. They came in trucks mostly, parking along the fence line in the way of people who were accustomed to improvising parking, and they stood at the gate in the early April chill with the particular posture of farmers at an unfamiliar property. Interested but measured, withholding judgment until they'd seen something worth judging. June recognized the posture because she'd worn it herself at other people's operations over the years. It was not unfriendly. It was just honest about the fact that they hadn't decided yet. Harold Dunning was there, which she'd expected. Pete Garver had driven up from the next county with Dennis and 2 other men she didn't know. There were 3 women, one June's age, 2 younger, who had come together in a single truck and stood slightly apart from the main group, with the self-contained manner of people who were used to being the only women in rooms like this. June made a point of going to them first. "June Holloway," she said. "Welcome." The older of the 3, her name was Vera, she farmed 45 acres of depleted bottomland in the next county, looked at the fields behind June with the evaluative attention of someone doing rapid mental calculations. "How long have the chickens been on that far section?" "That's the last section on the north end. They started it in February. 6 weeks now." "And what were the pre-rotation numbers on that piece?" "Organic matter at 0.6%, depth to hard pan at 7 inches, basically no detectable microbial biomass." Vera looked at her. "Same as my east field." "Come see it," June said. She walked all 31 of them through the full rotation, the same way she'd walked Harold through it, the same way she'd walked Roland's farmers through it, but this time with more people and more questions, which meant it took twice as long and covered twice the ground, because the questions were good ones. These were people who understood soil and understood farming and were not asking out of polite curiosity. They were asking because they had their own depleted sections and their own debt situations and their own versions of the same problem June had been staring at 14 months ago. And they wanted to know if what they were looking at was real and whether it translated. She tried to be honest about both things. Yes, it was real. She had the documentation and the university data and the market records to prove it. And it translated, but with conditions. It required holding sections out of production during the restoration phase, which was a financial hit that not everyone could absorb. It required consistent movement of the pens, which required time and physical labor that wasn't always available. It required patience with a timeline that didn't cooperate with bank deadlines or family pressure, or the particular human need to see results immediately. What's the minimum viable flock size? One of the younger men asked. Depends on your acreage and what you're trying to restore. For a quarter acre of garden beds, you could do this with 40 birds. For field scale, you need more to get the impact density right. And the pen construction, I'll show you. She took them to the shed where she kept the spare pen components and walked them through the design, which had evolved over 14 months from the rough first versions she'd built alone from scrap lumber into something more refined. Easier to drag, better ventilated, with an improved corner latch design that didn't crack in freezing temperatures the way the first ones had. Paulson was there in the background, taking notes on his own clipboard and occasionally answering the more technical soil biology questions with the academic precision that June deliberately did not try to replicate. That was his register, not hers. Her register was practical and direct, and based on what she'd actually done and what had actually happened, including the things that had gone wrong, which she talked about without embarrassment because they were part of the record too. I lost 20 birds over the first winter, she said, when someone asked about mortality rates. 19 to cold and 1 to a fox that figured out the pen corner I hadn't reinforced properly. Plan for losses. They're part of it. She showed them the ledger. Not the summary version she'd made for the county commission, but the actual ledger. The handwritten daily entries going back to September. The messy early pages where she was still figuring out the system. The corrections and crossouts. The margins filled with calculations she'd second-guessed and revised. She let them hold it and page through it, because she'd decided somewhere around November that the most useful thing she could offer was not a polished version of what she'd done, but the actual thing, with all its evidence of uncertainty and adjustment. Vera held it for a long time, turning pages carefully. You wrote every day? Most days. I skipped when things got bad in January. I've got about a week of gaps during the hardest cold. That's more discipline than I have, Vera said. It's not discipline, June said. I needed the record for the bank. I kept it because I was scared of losing track of what was working. She paused. Fear is a pretty good motivator for paperwork. Vera looked at her. A real look, the kind that was about more than what was being said. And then she nodded once and handed the ledger back. Martha came at noon, which June had arranged in advance, by simply telling her when food would be ready, because telling Martha she was being honored or celebrated would have caused Martha to find a reason not to come. June had made chili in the large pot from her father's cabinet, the one with the dented handle she'd never replaced, and she'd set up a folding table near the barn with mismatched bowls and a stack of napkins held down by a rock against the April wind. It was not elegant. It was food, hot and sufficient, and 31 farmers and 3 university researchers ate it without complaint. Martha sat in the canop chair June had placed specifically near the table and received the people who came to her because several of them knew who she was, and the ones who didn't figure it out quickly from context, with the same short, undemonstrative manner she applied to everything. She didn't hold court. She just answered questions when people asked them, accurately and without wasted words, and let the answers be what they were. At one point, June overheard Martha telling Pete Garver, "Your interval's going to need to be shorter than hers because your clay content is higher, slower biological cycle. Don't copy her numbers directly. Adjust down." Pete Garver wrote something in a small notebook he'd brought. How much shorter? Half a day, maybe. Watch the surface. If the ground's starting to compact under the birds, move them sooner. The ground tells you. June turned away before Martha noticed she'd been listening, because Martha would have found it annoying to be observed doing something kind. After everyone had gone, late in the afternoon, June walked the property alone. She did this sometimes, not for any practical purpose, not to check on the pens or assess a section, but just to walk it, the way she had in that first week in September when she'd been taking inventory of something that looked like failure. It didn't look like that now. The garden beds in the south were into their second full season of production, and the soil in the earliest restored sections had continued to develop past what she'd measured in March. The organic matter was approaching 3% in the primary beds. The earthworm density was high enough that she found them without looking for them, which was the kind of thing that sounds small and wasn't. The north field, where the restoration was newest and therefore least complete, was already showing the first real signs of change: darker surface color, a visible improvement in water infiltration after rain, the early cover crop establishing with the particular vigor of plants that had soil biology working in their favor. The full 40 acres was not restored. She was clear-eyed about that. The north end needed another full rotation season. There were sections in the middle field where she'd had to compromise the interval due to weather, and they were behind where she wanted them. The property was a work in progress, as it had been and would continue to be, because that was the nature of land. It was never finished, never fully solved, always asking the next question. But the direction was unmistakable. And the direction, she had learned over 14 months of keeping a ledger and reading the soil every week, was the only thing you could reliably control. Not the destination, just which way you were moving. She stopped near the far fence line, where the land ran closest to the seasonal creek, and stood looking back across the whole of it, the trellised beds, the established fields, the chicken pens working the far sections, the barn her father had built in the 1980s and never quite finished repairing, the house with the broken window latches, 2 of which she'd finally fixed in January, and 2 of which still needed doing. The refrigerator list was still there. She'd taken it down once in February, intending to throw it out. She'd put it back the same evening, not because she owed her father sentiment. He'd been difficult in life and not particularly easy in memory, but because the list was honest, and honesty about what hadn't been done seemed more useful than the fiction of a clean slate. She had fixed 3 things on the list. She was going to fix the remaining window latches before winter. The rest she would get to on a schedule that depended on whether the market season continued to build and whether the loan renegotiation with Roland held through the second year. These were not certainties. She did not operate in certainties. What she operated in was evidence and adjustment, and the willingness to move the pen when the ground said it was time. The loan was paid in full on a Thursday morning in February, 16 months after June had walked into Holt County Savings and told Hector Walsh she needed until spring. It wasn't a dramatic moment. She drove to the bank, handed over a check drawn on the farm account which had not existed 14 months ago, and Hector Walsh processed it with the slightly stunned manner of a man who had not actually expected this outcome. "Well," he said, looking at the check and then at her. "Well, June." "Is there paperwork?" she said. There was paperwork. She signed it. She took her copy. She drove home. She sat in the truck in the driveway for about 5 minutes, looking at the barn. The chickens were audible from the far field, that low, constant sound they made while working, not quite a cluck, more of a sustained murmur. And the February light was the same flat gray it had been at her father's funeral, except that it fell now on ground that was not the same ground it had been then. And that difference, invisible from any distance, was everything. She got out of the truck and went back to work. Paulson's first published paper on the rotational pastured poultry study came out in a regional agricultural journal in March. June was listed as a co-author, which he had insisted on and which she had argued about and then accepted, because Martha had told her to stop arguing about it, and she generally found that stopping an argument when Martha told her to saved everyone time. The paper documented the soil restoration outcomes over 16 months, the methodology in full technical detail, and, in the section that Paulson said generated the most interest from other researchers, the economic model, what the system cost, what it produced, and what the timeline looked like between investment and return. It was honest about the hard parts. It was also honest about the results. She read it the evening the print copy arrived, sitting at the kitchen table, and she got about halfway through before she had to stop and make coffee because she needed a minute. Not because it was emotional, exactly. More because it was strange to see the things she had lived. The earthworms in November, the county commission meeting, the morning she'd dug 2 holes in the north field and seen the difference with her own eyes, rendered in precise academic language, measured and cited and structured into an argument that other people could evaluate and build on. Strange, and also right. That was the whole point of documentation. You kept the record so that the thing you learned didn't die with the season. You kept it so that someone else, somewhere else, with their own 40 acres of depleted clay and their own stack of unpaid debt, could find it and know that the ground could come back if you gave it the right question to answer. Vera called the day after the paper came out. She'd gotten a copy through the extension network. I started the rotation on the east field, Vera said, 6 weeks ago. How's it looking? Slower than I expected. Higher clay content, June said. Martha told Pete to cut his intervals shorter. Did you adjust? A pause. I was using your numbers. Don't. Your ground is different from mine. Watch the surface compaction and cut the interval when you see it starting. Probably go to 2 days instead of 2.5. Okay. Another pause. The bank gave me 90 days. Same situation you were in. June was quiet for a moment. She knew exactly what 90 days felt like from the inside. The specific weight of a deadline that was neither close enough to create urgency nor far enough to create comfort. The first thing you'll see is earthworms, she said. Might be 6 weeks, might be 8. When you find the first ones, write it down and call me. It matters. Matters how? Matters because it tells you the biology is moving. After that, everything else is just patience and interval management. She paused. You're going to be okay, Vera. A longer pause. You don't know that. No, June said. I don't. But I know the ground can come back if you give it what it needs in enough time. That's not a guarantee. It's just what I've seen. Vera didn't say anything for a moment. June could hear the particular silence of someone sitting with information they wanted to believe and weren't sure yet if they could afford to. All right, Vera said finally. 2 days. 2 days. And write everything down. Hush. The second field day in June drew 47 people, which meant June had to borrow Martha's long folding table and Harold Dunning's extra camp chairs and the coffee percolator from the Keys household, because Donna Keys had offered it, and June had, after a brief internal debate, said yes. She was getting better at saying yes to help. It did not come naturally. It was, she had decided, a skill like any other, one that required practice and deliberate attention and the willingness to be wrong about her own self-sufficiency, which she was wrong about more often than she liked to admit. Lily, Paulson's graduate student, came to the second field day and presented the preliminary findings from the parallel study she was beginning on Pete Garver's East Field. Same methodology, different soil type, different county, different history. It was the beginning of the replication data that would eventually determine whether what June had done on her 40 acres was specific to her specific ground or was something that could be generalized, something that could travel. June listened to Lily's presentation from the back of the group, which was a different vantage point than she usually occupied, and she thought about what it meant to have started something that was now larger than the place it started. Not because she'd intended it that way. She'd intended to save her father's land and pay off a bank loan, and those had been sufficient goals for September. But because the thing that worked on 40 acres of Missouri clay turned out to be the same thing that worked on the ground in principle, and principle, unlike 40 acres, had no fence line. Afterward, walking back through the fields as the last of the visitors drove away, she found herself next to Harold Dunning, who had come to both field days and had driven away both times with the look of a man adding up a long column of numbers. My East 40, he said. I'm going to try it. June looked at him. What changed your mind? Harold was quiet for a moment, watching the chickens work the far section. Steady, oblivious, methodical. I watched the ground change, he said. Over here, across the fence, all winter and into the spring. I watched it. And I kept thinking, my family has farmed that East 40 for 60 years. My grandfather, my father, me. He paused. And we've been doing the same thing that whole time, the same thing that's been slowly killing it. He turned his hat over, the old gesture. You can't keep asking the same question and expect a different answer, he said. It came out slightly uncertain, like he wasn't sure he'd phrased it right. June thought about the ledger entry she'd written on that first November morning when she'd found the earthworms. It's working. 2 words. The understatement of 16 months of work. No, she said. You can't. What do I need to start? 100 birds minimum for that acreage. Movable pens. I'll show you the construction again. I made some changes since October that'll save you trouble in the freeze. And a notebook. She looked at him. Write everything down, Harold. Every section, every date, every time you move the pen. When it works and when it doesn't. The record is half the work. He nodded, and she could see him committing to it in the way that farmers committed to things. Not with words exactly, but with a particular quality of attention that meant the decision was made. That evening, after Harold had gone and Martha had gone, and the folding tables were stacked against the barn wall and the coffee percolator was back in Donna Keyes's car, June walked the property one more time in the long June light. She thought about a thing Martha had said to her once. In November of the first year, when June had called with the earthworm data, Martha had said, "It's a good start, June. It's a real good start. Not more than that." Martha never gave more than that. But at the time, in that kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, it had been exactly enough. She stopped near the south beds, the ones the chickens had worked first, all the way back in October 14 months ago. The soil there was the oldest restored ground on the property now, and it showed. Not dramatically, not in any way a stranger would notice walking past on the road, but undeniably in the way the plants sat in it, the way the surface held moisture, the way a handful of it broke apart in your palm with that living, complex texture that dead soil couldn't fake. 3% organic matter, 40-plus earthworms per square meter, 14 inches to hard pan. It had taken 60 years to exhaust this ground. It had taken 16 months to begin bringing it back. That was not an advertisement for the system. It was a fact about both the damage that accumulates slowly and the restoration that, given the right conditions, moved faster than anyone expected. She thought about her father. Not sentimentally, she'd made her peace with who he'd been and who he hadn't been, and that peace was of the practical variety, the kind that allowed you to acknowledge a thing fully without being destroyed by it. He'd stayed on this land his whole life and hadn't known how to save it. He'd handed it to her in the worst shape it had ever been, with a list of things he'd meant to fix, and she had fixed some of them and was fixing others. She'd asked the land a different question than he had, and the land had answered. That was what she would write in the protocol document she was preparing for Paulson's department, the practical guide for other farmers, in plain language, with her measurements and her intervals and her mistakes included. She'd write the soil science correctly and the economics honestly and the timeline without softening the hard parts. But somewhere in it, probably near the beginning, she was going to write something that wasn't in any academic paper and wasn't in the ledger. That the ground is not your enemy. That land which looks finished is usually just waiting. That the question you ask of the soil determines what the soil can give you. And if the answer has always been the same poor answer, it might be time to ask something different. Not because that was easy, not because different questions didn't cost something. They cost time and money and the willingness to look foolish in front of people who were not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They cost the particular vulnerability of trying something visible and uncertain in a county where everyone was watching and most of them were waiting for you to fail. But the alternative was the list on the refrigerator. The alternative was someday, and someday, in June Holloway's experience, was just a polite word for never. She walked back to the house in the last of the evening light, past the barn with its unfinished repairs, and past the beds where the spring planting was up strong, and past the section where the chickens were already settled for the night. And she went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened the ledger to a new page. At the top, she wrote the date. Below it, she wrote second season, full property and active rotation for the first time. Field day, 47 people. Harold Dunning committed to East 40. Northfield organic matter trending toward 2.0%. Vera's Eastfield, week 6, awaiting first earthworm report. She looked at what she'd written. Then she added one more line. The ground is working. Keep going. She closed the ledger and finished her coffee. And outside, the Missouri evening went fully dark over 40 acres of land that had come back from the edge of nothing. Not because it had been easy, and not because anyone had believed it would happen, but because someone had stayed and asked the right question and been patient enough to listen to the answer.